The Holocaust, Israel and the Jewish Question, 1989 to the present. What is the nature of the Jewish question? How has it been adapted? And what does its continued presence tell us? David Seymour will explore. Eschewing conventional accounts of the present increase in anti-Jewish attitudes and actions as a return of anti-Semitism, this presentation places the contemporary moment within the broader horizon of an ongoing and unresolved Jewish question. David Seymour begins with a discussion of the essence of the Jewish question. Beginning as a reaction to the calls for Jewish emancipation at the turn of the 19th century, the Jewish question turns on the notion of an inherent, particularistic, hostile Jewish element that poses an obstacle and threat to universal emancipation. He then goes on to discuss the various iterations in which the Jewish question has appeared since that time. The conclusion notes that as the ongoing and contemporary presence of the Jewish question indicates, the social and political completion of Jewish emancipation remains a work in progress. David Seymour is Senior Lecturer in Law at City Law School, City St George's, University of London. He has written extensively on the topics of critical theory, Holocaust memory, anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism.
So, I would like to welcome everybody to this event of the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. And I would like to welcome very much our speaker today, who is David Seymour. My name is David Hirsch, by the way. I am the Academic Director of the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. David Seymour is a very old friend and colleague. He teaches in the law school. He's a senior lecturer in the law school of City University, which he just told me has now got a new name, which I can't remember what it was, something to do with St George. David, you're very welcome. The title of his talk is The Holocaust, Israel and the Jewish Question, 1989 to the present, although David just told me that he has changed the title, although he didn't tell anyone that he's changed the title. So the title is only changed inside his own imagination. And perhaps he will share his new title with us all. David, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Centre. David, thank you very much for inviting me. And Martine, as always, thank you so much for making this possible. It's also nice to see some people who looks like they're driving in their cars, which sounds like a pop song. So thank you very much. I'm in the law school. It's now called City St George's, University of London. As David said, I've changed the title slightly, and the title is called Israel, the Holocaust, and the Ends of the Jewish Question, 1989 to the present. This is very much a work in progress. Obviously, the paper is hopefully complete, but it's very much the ideas are in progress. So if you don't mind, I will read, but I'll try and make it better than just watching somebody just read a paper. Okay, so the title, Israel, the Holocaust and the Ends of the Jewish Question, 1989 to the present. This paper is part of my ongoing work of trying to understand what is euphemistically called an uptick in anti-Semitism. Evidence of this uptick includes the relatively recent anti-Semitism crisis in the Labour Party, events of Charlottesville, the Tree of Life synagogue murders, as well as arguments relating to Brexit and COVID. More recent, of course, is the recourse to anti-Jewish narratives of the 7th of October and its horrific aftermath and its increasing appearance in the Trump campaign. When thinking about these events and others, I was also struck by the sheer speed with which anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist myths replace rational explanations and rational debate. Underpinning these reflections, I felt, was the shortcomings of many contemporary understandings of what is called anti-Semitism itself. For myself, one of the problems with these understandings is that they are presented in un- or asocial terms. This shortcoming appears in locating anti-Semitism, I'll use the word anti-Semitism for now, outside or beyond the mundane social world and the social relations of which it's comprised. The irony of these approaches, be they eternal anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism as a virus, anti-Semitism as a reservoir, is that their understanding of anti-Semitism reproduces rather than challenges the anti-Jewish image and the goal of excluding Jews from society in the first place. It is in the wake of these approaches that I have recently adopted the analogy of the Jewish question, which is a term I prefer to use, as a doppelganger of the modern rational world and the social relations of which is part. In short, as you know, a doppelganger is the double of a person with whom it shares an identical appearance. Yet, despite such visual congruity, the doppelganger differs in one fundamental way. It is evil, often pure, absolute evil. According to its folklore, it's also the harbinger of catastrophe or disaster. Although analogies always come up short, nonetheless, it's in the context of its meanings that the analogy of the doppelganger for the Jewish question can serve as a useful tool. It can do so in a number of ways. First, as we'll see in the following section, the Jewish question emerges as a negative response to Jewish emancipation. As such, it began and continues to articulate and mask its anti-emancipationism within the language of emancipation itself. It's for this reason, and this is the second point, that just as the question of Jewish emancipation was and continues to be articulated in the language of rational discourse, so does the Jewish question, again masking its irrationality. It does this by appearing in the garb of theology or philosophy, ethics, politics, the humanities, the science, history, culture. Indeed, it's as a testament to its entwinement within the rational world itself, that it's within the very DNA of the modern contemporary world. Indeed, there's not a single aspect of modern or contemporary life to which the doppelganger of the Jewish question does not attach. Third, just as Jewish emancipation, not only Jewish emancipation, is dependent for its social meaning on a broader set of norms, so too is the Jewish question. If Jewish emancipation is premised on the ideas and ideals of human freedom, equality, the rule of law, legal rights, etc., the Jewish question's opposition to emancipation is premised on opposition to those norms. In other words, the Jewish question presents us with the doppelganger not only of enmity to the Jews, but also with an alternative and complete worldview, one in which the ideals and institutions embodying actual and potential social freedom are eschewed and negated. Finally, and as a consequence of the last point, by placing the Jew or the Jews, and in the Jewish question's latest iteration, the Zionists and Israel, at the center of its distorted imagination, it cannot but reorder and reorganize the world around its own malevolent axis. If we leave aside for now the centrality of the Jewish question to national socialism, we can point by way of illustration to the Dreyfus affair, which for a brief or rather not so brief moment dissolved and restructured the entirety of French society around whether one stood for or whether one stood against the Jew. More recent examples are not hard to find. In what follows, I'm going to start with Jewish emancipation, its meaning, and then the next section following that, we'll look at the Jewish question in relationship to Jewish emancipation. The first point to note is that the Jewish question, which is little more than a rhetorical question, and as Fein and Spencer note, is not a question at all, is a thoroughly modern and contemporary development. This observation does not deny that anti-Jewish praxis did not exist prior to this time. Rather, to follow on a comment by Moishe Postone about the history of labor, while labor has always been a human activity, its social meaning altered radically when it became incorporated as a core component within capitalism. This analogy is not meant to imply a retreat to claims of eternal anti-Semitism, but rather to indicate that the Jewish question comes into existence in the context of a particular historical moment, and which in turn gives it a specific historic social meaning. If we look to this emergence, we see that it arises, interestingly, at the same time as the literary figure of the doppelganger, first at the turn of the 19th century. It arises at the same time and as a negative response to calls for Jewish emancipation. In other words, Jewish emancipation and the Jewish question stand in a dialectical relationship to each other. The use of the word dialectic points to the fact that the meaning of each, as well as the relationship between them, are socially mediated. It's for this reason that both Jewish emancipation and the Jewish question in various iterations are not only firmly rooted within the realm of social contradictions, but are expressions of those contradictions themselves. Here I will outline the general framework within which Jewish emancipation and the Jewish question are to be understood before looking directly at the Jewish question. As is well known, in its general conceptual meaning, emancipation was the vehicle for entry into modern society. It was through the granting of emancipation that the Enlightenment norms of universal human freedom were to be instituted in those societies born under its sign. However, almost immediately, emancipation's universalist ideal came into tension with a corresponding host of particularities, divisions of religion, of nation, of wealth, of class, of sex, etc. It was this tension that exercised the minds of contemporary thinkers. The crux of the problem was to solve this unresolved tension without, on the one hand, sacrificing the goal of universal freedom to that of particular individual freedom, and on the other hand, sacrificing individual freedom to universal freedom. It was within this dilemma and conundrum that the question of Jewish emancipation gained its meaning. From the outset, we can see that the question of Jewish emancipation contains and expresses these general tensions. On a mundane level, Jewish emancipation need not nor should not have posed any more or any fewer problems than the emancipation of any other group or collective, even if such other instances were, of course, fairly without contestation. However, while Jewish emancipation can be understood as merely one particular case among many, I would say uniquely, it simultaneously took on universal significance, in the sense that it called into question not only Jewish inclusion into modern society, but also called into question the entire edifice of Enlightenment norms of universal freedom on which this social world was to be built and emancipation was to be its means. The ironic outcome of this tension, created but specifically by Jewish emancipation, endowed it with an aura of existential or eschatological threat, almost entirely lacking in other instances. Not for nothing, therefore, did Hegel recognize Jewish emancipation as the measure of a civilized society in general. However, even at this stage of the discussion, we can see how the general contradiction between universal and particular besetting society in general was coming to be replicated within a specific instance or moment of Jewish emancipation. The point here is that even before we reach a discussion of the Jewish question, The aura of doppelganger is already contained within the question of Jewish emancipation itself. That is, to center itself as the question of the modern and contemporary era, along with its power to dissolve and reorganize the world, and whose contradictions it expressed. Let me explain this in more detail. At the heart of the debates around Jewish emancipation was the notion that there was something about the Jews that set them apart from other instances of emancipation. One can see this, interestingly, as much from those supporting Jewish emancipation as from those opposing it. This commonality is evident from the manner in which the debate was framed. For both opponents and proponents, there was, if not agreement, then at least an overlap that as things stood, that particular something presented both an obstacle and a threat to the realm of universal human freedom, into which and for which emancipation was to be granted. It is for these reasons that underpinning the question of Jewish emancipation were two related questions, but which in reality merged into one. First, should the Jews be emancipated into the societies in which they lived? And second, if so, on what conditions should emancipation be granted? What's interesting to note at this point is that the terms of the debate were accepted by both, as I said, proponents and opponents of Jewish emancipation. However, and this point is key, in my opinion, to the development of the Jewish question, despite this commonality of outlook, what came to separate the proponents and opponents was less the language of universal and particular, but the relationship between them. It is around the nature of the relationship between, on the one hand, universal freedom, and on the other, Jewish particularism, that although beginning with a question of emancipation, began to separate them and oppose one to the other. In turn, this change in the relationship gave rise to the Jewish question as opposition not only to Jewish emancipation, but to the Enlightenment norms of universal human freedom itself. So what is the essence of the Jewish question? For those who supported Jewish emancipation, either subjectively as well as objectively, the problem lay in how to reconcile, even if short of resolving, that tension between universal and particular. It was this approach that marks the pro-emancipationist work of both Hegel and Marx. For those on the other side of the debate, rather than reconcile that tension, they chose to oppose the one to the other. And here we think of Bauer, Marr, Dühring, etc. In other words, what marks the emergence of the Jewish question from the question of Jewish emancipation was less the acceptance of a tension between universal and freedom and an alleged negative Jewish particularism, but rather the way in which the Jewish question reframed that tension by positing it as a radical opposition one to the other, an opposition that at its core refused any notion of Jewish social inclusion. One further point is worth noting here. It's the Jewish question's use of the language of universal and particular that gives it credence as a doppelganger. By remaining within the language of universal and particular, proponents of the Jewish question appear as if they really are speaking the language of universal freedom, of human progress, etc., and so forth, when in fact, what they are replicating is now the 300-year-old lie that of all peoples, it is because there is still, again, something about the Jews that makes them an obstacle and threat to those values these writers still claim as their own. Moreover, it's also in the nature of positing the opposition between universal and particular that the Jewish question's tendency, like I mentioned before, to reorder and reorganize society around its imagery of the Jews is in that way granted its power. Here I want to look at the end or the ends of the Jewish question. If we look at the history of the Jewish question going back to the turn of the 19th century, one is struck by just how often it's claimed to have been resolved. The past 300 years or so have been punctuated by such claims. However, if we look at the matter more closely, we will find not only, to paraphrase Mark Twain, the reports of its death have been greatly exaggerated, but also that each end of the Jewish question may be better understood as a hinge between an older and newer iteration. These points lead us to another aspect of the Jewish question as doppelganger, that the forms in which these new iterations appear, religious, national, racial, etc., are themselves expressive of the dominant social tensions and discourses of the time. For present purposes, I'd like to focus on two such ends of the Jewish question before moving on to 1989. The first is around the 1870s and the second, obviously, 1945. If we look at least to Germany, at the literature on the Jewish question in the 1870s, it becomes clear how a putative end can be understood as a hinge. As we know, it was this time in Germany that Jews were granted full legal emancipation, which for many signaled the end of the Jewish question. However, as we also know, it also signaled the beginning of the racial iteration of the Jewish question. It was that year, 1870s, in which Marr coined the term anti-Semitism. Moreover, if we look at Marr's pamphlet, The Victory of Judaism over Germandom, in 1879, not only is it framed in the language of defeat, which for someone like Marr it was, but we also see its hinge-like quality. This latter point is most evident in the opening of the pamphlet, where Marr draws a strict demarcation between religious iterations of the Jewish question, which he tells us he opposes unequivocally, and that of its novel racial iteration, which is then carried forward by himself and others, such as Dühring and a few others, into the 20th century. It's precisely the same move we find a century later, or just over, the French philosopher Alain Badiou makes in the Jewish question shift from the racial anti-Semitism to anti-Zionism, which I argue is the latest iteration of the Jewish question. 1945, however, is in some senses more interesting. The irony of the decades following the Shoah was that it seemed as if its designation as the final solution to the Jewish question was accepted by all concerned. There is no doubt that in the wake of the extermination, anti-Semitism did fall into disrepute. By and large, anti-Semitism, the racial iteration of the Jewish question, in any meaningful sense, disappeared from the scene as a legitimate way of understanding the world and as a way of organizing populations or large sections of them. However, despite this retreat, a full reckoning of the Jewish question in the Shoah was put in abeyance for a host of reasons, one of them being, of course, the Cold War. It is in this context that 1989 can be seen as a watershed moment, bringing about a shift in the nature of society, of social relations, and correspondingly the Jewish question, and then by definition, the shortcomings of Jewish emancipation. I've got a few more minutes, so I'll briefly run through 1989. 1989 was and remains a turning point in contemporary history. A full discussion of why 1889 is 1989 is beyond the scope of this paper. but we can cite some reasons why 89 was so important. First, in the present context, perhaps the most important was the fall of the Berlin Wall and the beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. With the end of the Cold War, the abeyance of full discussions and the full reckoning of Nazism in general, and the Shoah in particular, came to an end. We began talking about it. However, this reopening of the past occurred with many germinal changes in which these discussions took place. The reunification of Germany, the defeat of, in England and elsewhere, the defeat of the trade union movement, the demise of the interventionist welfare states and the rise of neoliberalism, the rise of globalization along with notions of a globalized civil society, the passing of a Holocaust generation, both survivors and perpetrators. It is within this context, or rather expressive of these fundamental shifts in the social world, that we begin to identify the nature of the latest contemporary iteration of the Jewish question, anti-Zionism. Now, I want to clarify a point, unless I'm misunderstood, and I don't want to be misunderstood. The point, as noted throughout this paper, is that the doppelganger character of the Jewish question means that it's deeply embedded and entwined with the entire modern and contemporary world and all of its social relations. The concept of anti-Zionism is no exception. There is, of course, an anti-Zionism that has little connection with the Jewish question. This was especially the case before 45 and 48, and it's the case today. Less so, but it's still nonetheless present. However, what I want to show shortly is that there is a doppelganger of anti-Zionism in the way that it has been captured by the Jewish question. And as a way of sort of shorthand for this, the anti-Zionism I'm talking about is the anti-Zionism seen through the prism of the Jewish question, and that's why I write this particular type of anti-Zionism as a single word without a hyphen. Now, underpinning the changes in 1989 was a novel concept of emancipation. If at the turn of the 19th century, emancipation, Jewish and otherwise, was emancipation into the universal promise of the nation state, at the turn of the 21st century, it was emancipation, Jewish or otherwise, from that nation state into some form of borderless globalized society. Self-constituting, this new society was to be comprised of groups whose autonomy was said to have been repressed or suppressed by the demands of a national hegemony that characterized the now defunct nation state. It was in this context that Nazis' racial anti-Semitism and the Holocaust came to take on universal significance and served as a symbol, if you like, for the now transcended era as a whole. In other words, what amounted to a declaration of the end of the Jewish question, the birth of a new emancipated social world, placed not only the Holocaust, but its conditions of possibility, which was deemed to be the modern nation state, firmly in a now transcended past. However, as much as Nazism, the Holocaust, and its Jewish victims served as the universal hinge between the unemancipated past and the emancipated present, so too did it serve less as an end to the Jewish question, as a hinge between its previous racial iteration into its contemporary iteration of anti-Zionism. The irony of this latest version of the Jewish question, and in keeping with its image as doppelganger, is that it brings under its spell and incorporates, the new anti-Zionism incorporates the very events of Nazism and the Holocaust that, according to the contemporary world, have been consigned to the past and from which emancipation had become the hallmark of the new era. We see this in two ways. First, the Holocaust and Holocaust memory. I'm going to run through this fairly quickly. What happens here is once the Holocaust becomes a universal symbol for any injustice and harm caused by the system of nation states, therefore, this universal is posited against what's seen as an illegitimate Jewish particularism of memory. It's said that by the Jews trying to, the Jews trying to remember the Jewish dimension of the Holocaust is being posited against its universal elements, and therefore it comes under the idea that Jews are seeking a privilege, or that Jews are trying to silence other forms of genocide, be it colonial forms or pre-colonial forms of genocide. In other words, as with the essence of the Jewish question itself, the universal and particular aspects of the Shoah and of Nazism are ripped apart, and the one opposed to the other in the language of bad faith. Moreover, the Jewish particularism of commemorating the Jewish dimensions of the Shoah are seen as an obstacle and threat to the commemoration of all other forms of genocide. And moreover, the idea is also that by placing emphasis on Jewish particularity, the Jews are now trying to create a hierarchy of victimhood in which they are said to place themselves at the top. And of course, as we know more recently, both before and after 7th of October, is the idea that the Jews, who are now the Zionists, use the Holocaust to silence criticism of Israel. The Zionist weaponization of the Shoah. So the Holocaust becomes what marks the end of the Jewish question in 1945, becomes now a marker within the Jewish question itself. It becomes incorporated within the Jewish question as something to be thrown against the Zionists. And it's a moment in which in typical Jewish question style, the moment of Jews' ultimate powerlessness is somehow inverted into that of their ultimate power. The second aspect is Israel and the Jewish question. In ways similar to how Jewish attachment to the specific Jewish dimension of the Holocaust is treated as an obstacle and threat to the new emancipated era, so too is the birth and continuing existence of the state of Israel and those who hold or express any form of attachment to that state. Ripping apart and opposing the tension between the universal and particular that exists as general aspects of any modern contemporary body politic, the Jewish question presents Israel as nothing more nor less than the embodiment of the now transcended modern state. This presentation of Israel means that the tension between particular nationality and universal democracy for all its citizens is, when seen through the prism of the Jewish question, set in a relationship of opposition and enmity. Moreover, as we've seen, since this emphasis on the demand for national or ethnic homogeneity, an emphasis and demand that from the perspective of the new era is deemed the cause not only for the Holocaust, but for all crimes carried out in the name of the nation state in general, it follows that Israel in its present form a Jewish majority state, is said to be nothing but an anachronism, the legacy of a bygone unemancipated age. As such, it's said of all states, it remains unique as the only state left in which the conditions of genocide, in which the conditions of possibility of genocide are inherent in the constitution of the state from its moment of inception in 1948. Correspondingly, the accusation of genocide following Israel's often brutal, without doubt, response following 7 October is less a response to these events themselves, but it is rather an accusation of an original sin. And it's, of course, this presentation of Israel that underlines the claim of Israel as a so-called Nazi state, and therefore the right of its state as existing as a state is foreclosed. In this way, the Jewish question inverts Jewish emancipation through national self-determination into that of the starkest and most irredeemable breach of international norms and international law. I think just a couple more paragraphs before I conclude. If we pause here for a moment, we can see the ways in which the very events that are said to have marked the end of the Jewish question, the Shoah, the birth of Israel, have, through their capture by the Jewish question, come to serve as a hinge for its contemporary iteration as anti-Zionism. This continuity is evident in the ways in which the tensions between universal and particular that are present in both events, Holocaust and the birth of Israel, are ripped apart and posited in the language of radical opposition. And as with the question's previous iterations, those who express an attachment, no matter in what form, to the specifically Jewish dimensions of the Shoah or to the Jewish majority state of Israel, are not only cast outside or beyond the contemporary world, but also deemed to be or rather the obstacle and threat to the very ideals of universal emancipation on which the world is said to be built. And we've got examples of, I've got a section here, but we've got an example of that reordering of the world. And here I refer to David Hirsch's work and others, Durban. Durban is a classic example where the world was reorganized around Zionism, around the new iteration of the Zionist, of the Jewish question. There is a section which I'm not going to mention, but what I want to say is the Jewish question has always remained a temptation for the politically defeated. I tend to pull away from left and right anti-Semitism. As I said, 1989, there's no doubt that I use the word we, the left, were defeated. They were defeated in 1848, and previous members of the barricades, Wagner, Ma, etc., were tempted by the Jewish question. There's enough to tell us that if Donald Trump, Alavai, loses the election in November, he's already intimated it's going to be the Jews' fault. It won't surprise me if Trump's latent or occasionally mentioned anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, it's hard to know what it will manifest itself as, will become a factor. It's already there with the Great Replacement. So the Jewish question is always a temptation from left, right, and what we often forget from liberals in their moments of defeat. Let me just read my conclusion, which will take me a couple of minutes. In this paper, I've sought to understand and explain not only the ongoing presence of the Jewish question, the beginning at the turn of the 19th century, and despite many claims to its end, continues to the present day. I've argued further that each claim, the so-called end or ends of the Jewish question, serve more as hinges to mark the transition from one iteration to the other. It's within this history that I locate 1989 as beginning the Jewish question's contemporary iteration as anti-Zionism. In presenting this argument, I've argued on a more fundamental level that the Jewish question is intimately connected to the question of Jewish emancipation, from which it emerged and which it later confronted. Moreover, using the analogy of the doppelganger, I've located the Jewish question in all its iterations firmly within the social world, deeply entwined within the contemporary social world and social relations. Borrowing a phrase from the critical thinker Adorno, who says that even a lie tells a truth about society, the Jewish question may well be a lie, and nothing but a lie, but it nonetheless tells us a lot, not about itself, or possibly about itself, but it tells us more about the world in which we live in. What it tells us is that as long as there is a Jewish question, Jewish emancipation remains unfulfilled. And what this shortcoming tells us is the problem is not a, or rather only, the Jewish question. Of course, that's part of it. It's also expressive of a broader, unresolved social question. A question that in its universalist aspect is not confined to the particularities of Jewish emancipation, but in its particular aspect carries within it a universal significance. Thank you very much. Thank you.
David, thank you very much indeed. I just say and apologize actually because the sound quality was not perfect. It's fine. Just try to speak kind of clearly and consistently into the microphone. But actually, you were very clear, and that's why we did indeed follow everything. So it's not a disaster, I think. Wow, I have some questions of my own, but I will not hog the platform, and I will ask if people would like to come in and ask or comment or engage with that really interesting paper and rather depressing paper, I think. Louise.
Yeah, can you hear me? I'm muted there. And I follow your analysis, and can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, I highlighted the wrong person. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I'm sorry. I'll stop. Okay.
No, go and talk, and I will find you. And
there you are.
Okay. I follow your analysis, and it makes a lot of sense, looking specifically at the reaction to Israel's response to October the 7th. Would you say that that reaction is inevitable and unavoidable? And if so, where does that leave us?
I think we've got to be careful what we mean by unavoidable. I think at the time that it happened, yes, 7 October, the response to 7 October, if we just talk about 7 October now, the response was, I think, following the type of political situation we've been living in 1989, from 89 onwards, I think yes. I think we knew almost the day once we got, when we could start thinking again, I think yes. I think by then the Jewish question had come, in its latest iteration, had come to the fore. And I think it was, I don't want to use the word inevitable. I don't like the word of inevitability, but nonetheless, I think there was a bloody good chance that that was what was going to happen. And I'm sure all of us knew on 7 October, or a couple of days after, I think a lot of us were waiting for it. We knew it was going to happen in some form. What I think surprised many people, and this comment is more to my friends in the States. In Europe, I don't think it came as a shock to us. The Jewish question is so firmly entwined in Europe, and we were used to this. We have a history of this. We know about it. The vibe I got from a lot of my American friends is they were completely taken aback that no one came out and spoke in support of them. And I think in America, that came as a shock more than here. But I think here, especially those of us who have been involved in fights with UCU, fights within the Labour Party, we saw this coming a mile off. Mm-hmm. Although I still don't like the word inevitable.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you.
Daniel.
Yeah, thanks a lot for a really interesting introduction. A lot to think about. I still need to digest it, but a couple of questions which might help me. One, which will probably sound very metaphysical, but I'm not at all a religious person. I mean it more in a kind of materialist sense. Would it help your analysis to introduce the notion of evil? I mean, in the sense that, that Sartre uses it, for example, that Jews are associated with a kind of broader evil, whether it's the evils of capitalism, communism, or now Israel as perceived to be, I'm not saying this is actually the case, perceived to somehow represent the evils of Western civilization or the nation state. So does that help, or is it irrelevant? And then secondly, a more prosaic kind of question. I mean, I take your points about 1989. I don't disagree with any of what you said descriptively. But what about 1967? Because wasn't it in 1967 that so the Stalinist movement, for example, anti-Zionism, which really was for them a form of anti-Semitism, became a lot more central. Not that it started in 67, but became a lot more central then. And also the New Left as well kind of started emerging and had some real, I would argue, anti-Semitic tendencies. So does 1967 fit into your analysis at all, or is it not very relevant, or how do you see that?
Thanks, Daniel, for both of those questions. There is a debate to have on the meaning of evil, and I've mentioned doppelganger before, and people tell me to read Freud on the doppelganger and evil. But for present purposes, I don't want to get into that debate because I don't want to give the Jewish question any credence on the question of evil. I think that is about the people who perpetrate the crimes, and there's a whole literature. And I think, yes, it would enrich my work, but it's not something I'm going to do at the moment. So I don't want to dismiss your point. It's just not something that I will go to now. But I think the whole question of evil, radical evil, the banality of evil are very important, very much so. 1967, it probably could fit into my plan, but the reason it didn't, and I accept that change that happens in 67 after the 6-Day War, Israel occupies the West Bank and so on and so forth. The Soviet Union and Isabella's work on this is brilliant. I've got nothing to add to it. But it doesn't quite fit my schema in the sense that at 1945, it was that everyone pronounced the end of the Jewish question. And between 45 and 89, everyone agreed with that. I think what happens in 89 is the type of politics that's emerging in 67 becomes more overt and more general, more generic, and feeds in particular streams of political thought that it didn't do before. So 67, I didn't use it because it's not quite the marker of a hinge of the Jewish question that I think 45 was and I think 89 was. If that answers your question.
So, David, anti-Zionism is the Jewish question for the era when the Jewish question is no longer relevant?
As it was between 1870 and 1933, for example, yeah. It's a hinge.
Yep. Shelby.
Very interesting paper, but after October 7th, I had the feeling that I was in the midst of the Dreyfus Affair redux. And after Trump was elected, I used to work as an occasional proofreader for the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. And I remember calling up my supervisors and pointing out that after World War II, saying something anti-Semitic openly became distinctly uncool, even if you were. Just as after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., to say something racist likewise became not acceptable. But with the rise of Trump and his acolytes, all of those filters of civility have been ripped away. And unfortunately, we see people for what they are, what they believe, and how they feel. And it emphasized that as an historian, progress is not inevitable. Anyway, thank you again.
I completely agree with you. I think what's so shocking to many of us, and not just in the States, is that language, and not only about Jews, the language and the views that people would write on green ink and send to a newspaper is now part of public discourse. I think that tells us an awful lot. I agree with you completely. Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm wondering about that. I mean, I'm wondering that, for example, anti-Zionism in its most mainstream forms, and therefore arguably its most frightening forms, in its kind of Radio for Today program form, isn't open and frank and explicit. It still feels the need to express itself in ways that are acceptable. Indeed, we've always said it's not pretending, right? It's that anti-Zionism is not pushed by people who are anti-Semitic but are hiding it under an anti-Zionist cover. They're not pretending, they're for real, they're true believers, and they don't say things, like Trump. They don't say that they're coming to eat the cats and the dogs, right? They don't do that at all. And then, of course, while we don't trust Trump not to go and do a deal with Putin and with Iran, he hasn't actually, and it's kind of not quite good enough for us to kind of say, well, we know that he will, and we know he's really to blame, when actually, I don't know. What do you think? Both Shelby and David.
Shelby? You're on mute. Shelby, you're on mute. You're on mute.
4 years into the pandemic.
Just
yes. That shows how much I've learned from the pandemic. I still can't unmute the goddamn thing. But I'm optimistic about the election. Fool that I am. But I'm the smiling fool. But seeing what went on in college campuses, students, intellectuals, that SOB Chomsky using the language of settler colonialism, racism, all of the tropes and the entire garb of progressive thought. I tell you, I was totally amazed. And when I saw signs saying Queers for Palestine, I could hear my grandmother's voice. She used to say to us, Goyim. And I was saying, Gayim. So what can I tell you?
I don't think sort of that, okay, I respect that, just in case, I respect that the decision is that David Miller's anti-Zionism is a respected philosophical belief. I would like to say that. I understand that that's the decision, and as I was teaching in a law school, I respect that. And I actually do believe that David Miller is probably not an anti-Semite. However, it's his anti-Zionism that is the Jewish question now. It doesn't matter if he's anti-Semitic or not. We can go into this nice debate. I hate these debates. Oh, I mean, one of the sections of the judgment was a previous KC was reading through it all, and he was going through his stuff about how everything from the UJS through to people, you know, they're all part of this Zionist conspiracy. And the author of that earlier report writes, well, anyway, he wasn't talking about Jews, he was talking about Zionist institutions. So it's anti-Zionism. It's no longer matter whether it's anti-Semitic. Anti-Zion. I know you and I have disagreed about this. I can see because you're sitting forward. But to me, it's that anti-Zionism. So that when Alain Badiou spends his time in his book saying anti-Semitism was terrible, it was awful, and we have to be careful so it never happens again, I believe him. But then when he says Israel is an embodiment, and I'm paraphrasing here, of every wrong of today, that's the problem. I don't care whether he's anti-Semitic or not. To me, his anti-Zionism is that new iteration of the Jewish question of putting a Jewish particularity against a universal now.
See, I was going to ask the opposite in a way, because I said that the sort of today program anti-Zionism is very respectable, but the David Miller anti-Zionism pushes the envelope. You know, he says that every Zionist organization on the planet should be ended.
Yes.
And he also is quite happy to kind of play with the word Jew and the word Zionism. So I was thinking, on the one hand, you have the respectable, and on the other, you know, trying to create a kind of consensus around anti-Zionism, and on the other hand, you have the likes of David Miller pushing the envelope.
Yeah, I was thinking about this before I started talking. As I said before, there is an anti-Zionism that has a history, and it's legitimate. I might agree or not agree with it. And I don't want to get into a definition of when it passes from one to the other, but I think that's worth, at this stage, I'll say it's worth discussing. Okay.
Tammy, welcome.
Thank you. Excellent talk, David. Very interesting stuff. Just on that last note, I mean, I think some of the work that has been done recently using data and some of the studies shows that there's at least a correlation between anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist attitudes. Pretty strong correlation. So again, like whether it's anti-Semitism or not, it kind of, like you had mentioned in your talk that Mar was saying, you know, yeah, we can't be discriminating, you know, on religion, but this isn't religion, this is about politics. And to me, it's just a similar iteration, you know, this isn't about politics, this is about Zionists, it's not about Jewish people. Anyway, I just wanted to say, I just want to ask a question, really. I've been thinking a lot about this idea that this is kind of a new ish globalization of anti-Semitism, and that Durban was the starting point of that globalization of anti-Semitism, but that it's been like hyper accelerated through social media. We're seeing it play out in a way that it hasn't before, because anti-Semitism, you know, just studying it historically, you know, is usually confined, the different types of anti-Semitism was confined to certain countries, certain political systems. certain time periods, but it seems in a way it's sort of like, you know, anti-Semitism unleashed now. And that after October 7th, we've seen the first sort of real global, you know, anti-Semitic backlash that we've never really seen before. And I think that's one of the reasons why people in the US, particularly Jewish people who are involved heavily in, you know, progressive causes, were shocked about it, because the idea was there were safe places where anti-Semitism wouldn't really reach, at least not that kind of anti-Semitism. One of them is the United States, and one of them is Israel. And that obviously in Europe, it's different, as you say, a different history, you know, more experience with what's going on. But I think that's one of the shocking reasons. So if you could just say, you know, a little bit about that, like how it's kind of this globalization of a response that makes it slightly different. Like Shelby was saying, you know, like the Dreyfus affair, but this time with Wi-Fi and social media, with TikTok. And the other thing is just a point about the Jewish question being a temptation for the defeated. I think I'm concerned that regardless of who wins or loses, I'm actually more pessimistic about the outcome of the election than Shelby. Unfortunately, hope I'm wrong. But there's already been a lot of talk about the Pennsylvania governor being Jewish and being, you know, looked over supposedly by Harris because of his Jewish background. And but anyway, it's been in the news a lot that, hey, this governor is Jewish. So you can imagine a scenario where the election comes down to the electoral college votes in Pennsylvania. And suddenly Harris's victory is blamed on the Jewish governor of Pennsylvania, who threw the votes for her or whatever. And then on the flip side of that, you have, if Harris loses, you have the possibility of people blaming her positions on Israel. You've already seen that in sizable sections of the left saying, well, you shouldn't have given us you shouldn't have supported genocide. You shouldn't have given us a quote unquote genocide. You shouldn't have given us a candidate who supported that. So that's the kind of, that's just my 2 cents on the way in which the Jewish question could be involved in the potential outcome of the election in a few weeks. So.
Okay, the first thing is, hi, Tammy. I hope you're well. It's nice to see you. The first thing is anti-Semitism on one level has always been global. The very first anti-Semitic movements were always pan-national, around about the 1880s, 1890s. Because Jews exist across the world, anti-Semites who do nothing, someone recently called it the hallucination of a projection, which I think is a beautiful phrase. I wish I would have thought of it. I can't remember, no disrespect to the person who came up with it. So it's always been global or transnational. But without a doubt, two things. First, X and the whole social media has now globalized, just made globalization easier. But I also think after 1989, with the idea of a global civil society, I think that's also impacted that global link. And I think that's what sort of realigned global movements in some way against Zionism, Zionists, and Israel. So that's the first thing. What was interesting is, as I was listening to you, it was interesting that you gave examples of a left Jewish question and a right Jewish question. And I think, bang, that's the danger. What we're seeing is a realignment in a way, and Shelby mentioned the Dreyfus affair. So it's where you stand in relationship to the Jews or Jewish things or Zionism. So instead of the rational politics of left and right and all the messy bits in between, what we're getting is two sides jostling on which Jew what type of Jew they're going to stand for and what type of Jew they're not. So in a way, what we're seeing frighteningly in America is actually a pure example of how the Jewish question is replacing the rationality of politics, not completely, but replacing it as the central position around which one organizes. The only other thing I'll say about the election is it'll be good to see John King again. I miss that man.
Oh,
So on CNN. So but on a more
John Curtis, though.
oh yes, yeah. But I think it's interesting that you could take examples from both left and right, and that's what scares the poop out of me, in a way.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tammy. Melissa, Raphael, it's very much a pleasure to see you here, and I will take the opportunity to mention that you will be doing this lecture in 2 weeks' time, and the title of your lecture will be Zionism as a Modern Jewish Ethical Project.
That's right.
A post-October 7th perspective. You're very welcome, Melissa.
Thank you. Good to see you all, and thanks for the plug. I just realised as you were talking that I've been using this phrase, the Jewish question, much as I would use a phrase of similar vintage, the woman question, as if its content is just self-evident. And I just realized that, well, you know, Hitler uses it, Marx uses it. And I just wonder now if you could say a little bit more about the question that my existence raises for the world, because I just realized I'm not quite clear anymore what that phrase actually means.
It's funny because I've been digging out books with the word Jewish question in it. And there's one out, really interesting, there's one by Daniel Borian. And it's called The No-State Solution. And he's talking about it as a solution to the Jewish question. And it's an interesting book. I'm flicking through it. I can't find what he means by that. And I'll be perfectly frank. It was Robert Fine and Philip Spencer's book that did it. They problematized what the Jewish question was, and it's their work that actually gave the impetus to this. It's not a question. There's no woman question. It's a misogynist question, or the misogynist's question. You know, women can vote. It's okay. The world won't end. So I think we need to think about that. We need always to question the question.
Yeah.
And you're dead right. Everyone assumes there's a Jewish question. But what the heck is it? And that's why I think Robert and Philip's book is worth reading. There's also, and I haven't got through it all yet, but a rather good book by, I can't remember her first name, Chase, The Age of Questions. And she locates the age of questions within a particular historical period. And so she problematizes the whole, because she said, you know, we have issues and we have problems, but all of a sudden we have questions. And I haven't completed that book. It's quite a tricky book, but I think she does a lot to problematize the question of the question. And if I may, I would recommend that to you. But yeah, I mean, like you, the more I thought about it, in America, you know, about Black emancipation, it's not about Black Americans, for God's sake, it's about white Americans. It's not, it might be the question of America, but it's not a Black question or African American. Very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
The two of you kind of universalized the Jewish question, the question, right? But I'm worrying about what is unique about the Jewish question. Why is Jewish emancipation the subject of this you know, endless, not really debate, but sort of ostensibly a debate? Well, so is it just that every question, or at least every question that represents a sort of unjust structure of exclusion that you would like, the women question, the Black question, is the Jewish question just like them, or is there something especially unique about the Jewish question? And I mean, the other thing I wanted to ask you, David, really is what is kind of underneath what does using this discussion about the Jewish question, what does hanging it on the Jewish question add to a discussion about anti-Semitism? Because in the end, the answer is that the Jewish question is an anti-Semitic question, and it's a kind of unique question. So what is it about the Jewish question that what does it answer for us?
Okay. The first thing I'll say, and I implied this or mentioned it in the paper, every question has a universal and particular. I think in Europe, I'm loath to talk about the States, to be honest. In Europe, I think the Jewish question does have more weight. I think there is something specific about it that doesn't attach to other types of emancipation. Whether it's the long history of the Christian church or whatever, I don't think it's simply transference. I think of all the questions, that was the one that goes to the core of A, the Enlightenment, and B, the counter-Enlightenment. And I think in some ways, whilst all questions, the woman question, whatever, has a universal significance, because they all question universal freedom, universal norms, I think there is something about the Jewish question that can organize masses, at least in Europe, in a way that no other question can. I think there's a historical weight to it that gives it a universal significance that other forms of discrimination don't. And as to your second point, what extra does the Jewish question give? I think it gives two things. I think a lot of people who discuss anti-Semitism, I think we have to be careful conceptually what we're talking about. There's been a couple of papers recently that have come out that says, well, anti-Semitism only begins in 1870 and blah, 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 as if that's it, as if there was no other form of modern anti-Jewish prejudice. And I think it masks that we don't live in a world of racial anti-Semitism. And I think it masks those other forms of anti-Jewish discrimination, but doesn't include every single Jew and doesn't include Auschwitz. The other thing is, I think I remember being in a paper years ago asking, why is racism and anti-Semitism a bad thing? Why is it a bad thing? Lots of people love it. And I think what the Jewish question does, by locating it within the idea of Enlightenment thought and the idea of the norms of the Enlightenment, it brings that back into view. That it's not people being nice thinking, let the Jews have the vote. It's actually about defending what moments of freedom we actually have, which is not to pretend that the Enlightenment was non-contradictory and everything and so on and so forth. But without I think it was, what's his name? Baron Solo, the old Jewish historian, the one who came up with the idea of the lachrymose Jewish history. And he's great. He said the only time that Jews actually could enter the world and feel secure was post-emancipation liberalism. It was the only time because of the norms underpinning it. And I think we have to bring back those norms into view. The old 1980s, 1990s about, the Enlightenment was nothing other than racism. It's representation. It wasn't perfect. It's full of the contradictions that I mentioned. But I think there's something outside. Otherwise, it's Jews versus non-Jews, which I've never thought of when I think about the Jewish question. It only makes sense because of these universal norms that humanism brought into the world. And I think we should remember that.
I'm going to go back to Shelby, and Melissa, if you have more engagement in your mind, you're very welcome too. Shelby.
Historically in the US, during the progressive era up until the 1920s, there were a lot of things that were prefaced as the Jewish question, the woman question, the race question, the labor question, so on and so forth. And progressives proposed these questions, and proposed solutions as well. For the race question, the solution was Jim Crow laws. And for the woman question, well, that ended up finally in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. But all along, these things were posed as questions. Max Eastman, the American socialist, said, you know, feminism is simply the radical concept that women are human beings. And he refused to speak to a woman question. He said, what we've got here is a human question. Anyway, that's my, the other thing that I would question is the timing, not so much 1946, not so much 1989. Go back to the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Go back to the anti-Semitism of the Communist Party, which has continued through magazines such as the Jewish Current and in various left-wing Yiddish publications. Anyway, that's my quick comment.
Yeah, I mean, the parts I've read of Chase's book, she said whoever writes the question has the answer and then asks the question. And whilst Jim Crow, the evils of Jim Crow was an answer, the advantage of bringing it back into a context is we know why it was wrong. It wasn't just bad, it was wrong according to values and ideals. And yes, you're right. I mean, you know, the 1918 was going to be the end of the Jewish question and the Soviet Union. You know, it was socialist, but for a lot of Jews, the end of the Jewish question was going to be a socialist or a communist. That didn't work out either. For a lot of non-communists, capitalism was going to be the answer to the Jewish question. We were all going to be, you know, Marx. That's actually Marx. Marx was pro that, you know, we'll leave aside other aspects of his article, but where he says, look, Jews are private property holders like everyone else. They enter the market, they enter civil society, end of the Jewish question. So everyone has ended it. And alas and alack, we're still falling short of it. Thank you, Shelby.
Melissa, yes, no?
I did have one quick question.
I thought you might.
I mean, that word solution, rather sort of chilling version of an answer to a question. And do you think that in some ways there's a link between proposed one-state solutions, and I know there are different iterations of the so-called one-state solution, the two-state solution. Do you think that people are thinking, well, that would end the Jewish question? I mean, in other words, where do you think in the future the Jewish question is going to go? How is it going to be answered? Or is it universally a sort of eternal question?
No, I think, you know, Israel-Palestine, that's a political question. And it has a political answer. At the moment, a one-state solution, and unfortunately even a two-state solution at the moment, is what does Hegel say? Here's roads, dance on roads. It's got nothing to do with the Jewish question. The actual horribleness that's going on in that region. That's a political answer. In as much as the Irish question turned out to be Mo Mowlam sitting down with everyone and getting them to agree, not, you know, power sharing or what have you. So I don't know what the political answer is to the Middle East. We all have our own particular views, but I don't think it's an answer to the Jewish question. It'll be interesting. My own view is if Israel and Palestine get sorted, as everyone here hopes it does, I don't necessarily think that'll be the end of the Jewish question in Europe or the States. because of the shortcomings of emancipation from the first start.
Interesting.
I was at Ivor Chitkin's conference in Johannesburg a couple of weeks ago, which was opened by Etienne Balibar, who refused to be deterred from participating by the boycott movement. And he turned up and he said that Jewish statehood, the statehood of the State of Israel, was bestowed by the UN, but conditionally. That statehood was conditional. And I know that you have something interesting to say about that. And he also went on actually to mention that President Trump's son-in-law is in Gaza as we speak, measuring up nice plots of land by the beach. And this is Etienne Balibar, one of the left scholarly heroes of the 20th century. Quite amusingly, Benny Morris kept on saying this man was introduced as a great philosopher.
Yeah, I mean, this idea that somehow, well, you know, let's get rid of Italy. I mean, Maloney's in power in Italy. You know, if only it was the case that bad, you know, that bad governments equal, you know, conditionality. It's nonsense. It's just not how it works, unfortunately or fortunately.
But
Sorry,
I mean, the concept of conditionality
yes.
is the meat and drink of the Jewish question, right? That Jewish emancipation was conditional.
Yes, we spoke about that a few weeks ago. Yeah, providing Jews behave themselves, that led to the whole assimilation thing, being a Jew at home, etc. That's right. It's just a replication of that. Yeah. Sorry, David, I'm not sure. I think on my screen there's someone called Simon who's waving his hand. I don't know if that means.
Oh, okay, hang on.
Sorry, I don't know if that means he needs.
Simon, did you say?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know if that's.
Simon, can you speak? Are you unmuted? There you are.
Yeah, I did. This is my first time, so please be Gentile with me. It's a little joke there. I want to spice this up a bit by being a bit controversial. Is that all right?
Maybe.
Oh. Well, it's been quite I think David's it was very interesting. I want to speak to three things that have come out of it. One is universalism versus particularism. I made a note somewhere here. I'm quite old, so I tend to forget things. Supranationalism. David, you mentioned David Seymour. You mentioned how things changed when post-war things became more globalist. I want to speak to the one-state solution, and also David Hirsch, you talking about exclusion. And I'm going to ask a question of whoever wants to answer it, David Seymour. And this might have clues to where I'm going. I hope it does. Israel plays football in Europe, and it sings songs in Europe, in Eurovision. But could Israel, if the EU wanted Israel to join, could it and would it? No, so don't no, forget would it. Could it? Could Israel either be invited to join in its present state, if it wanted to, and if the EU wanted it to? I hope I just want you to think about that. There's a point behind this. I promise. Trust me. Should I explain what the point is?
I think so.
Okay, I'll explain what the point is. If you join the EU, you have to have. You could be Hungary, and you can be Italy, and you can be well, not the UK, sadly, and France. And you can be British, sorry, you can be French and Hungarian and in Italian. But you have to allow for freedom of movement of anyone and everyone. In theory, everyone in the EU could emigrate to Germany, correct? Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah. I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, so everyone could get jump in their cars and drive to Germany and settle there. If Israel knew, everyone, if they wanted to, I'm sure not many people would, not given the recent situation. But in theory, Israel would have to open its borders to anyone and everyone in the EU. And I don't think it could. And I don't think it would. And I don't think it would want to, because it wants to remain, as much as possible, an ethno-nationalist state, which no state in the EU is. Hungary notwithstanding, no state in the EU can be ethno-nationalist. It can't remain in the EU if it were. That's not to say you can't have laws as to who is Hungarian.
I would have thought,
French, but
I would have thought that if Israel and its neighbours joined the European Union, and if they all signed up to the laws and norms of the European Union, then there would be absolutely no problem with having freedom of movement. The problem, of course, with freedom of movement, I would imagine, is that Israel's neighbours do not and will not sign up to the laws which protect member states. David, what would you say?
Well, first of all, the only reason Israel plays in Europe is because the countries in this region won't play them. The only reason...
No, that was just... Yeah, sorry.
No. But the only reason that Israel's in Eurovision is because they're on the same network. There's no, that's quite simple. And this idea, I agree with David. If for some reason, I mean, my hope is that Israel would join a Middle East version of an EU rather than a Europe one. They'd become a bloc, like NAFTA and like the EU, and they'd be able to join. And this idea that of all the nations, Israel is the only ethno-national nation.
No, not of all the nations. Of all the nations in the EU. Of course, there are ethno-nationalist countries around the world. I'm talking about Israel sees itself as a bastion of Western democracy, while at the same time maintaining incredibly tight rules about who can enter and live in the country. And I'm saying that is an issue that no one this evening has been discussing in relation to any of these problems that you're throwing up. And David went on about exclusion. Why, Jews being excluded? Well, we go and get our own country for the first time after 2,000 years of exclusion. And what do? We exclude the rest of the world.
No, we don't. I'm not Israeli. But as far as I understand,
I'm saying we Jews get our own country after 2,000 years of exclusion. And what do we Jews, as in the Jewish homeland, do?
No. Israel is a state. Israel is a state. It has immigration rules like every other state.
No, it doesn't. It does not.
Simon, would you let David answer the question, please?
Okay. Sorry.
My apologies. It's okay. It's a Jewish majority state. I accept that. People can move to Israel. They can immigrate there, as they can anywhere else. But this idea that somehow Israel as a state is different because of it's hard to articulate. But this idea that we're somehow, because of our own history, the judgment of Israel, how you judge Israel, is according to law. And let's be honest. How you judge Israel is not the 2,000 years of Jewish history. You judge Israel according to international law, and it has breached some international law. I don't think anybody here would disagree. But you don't sort of somehow use Jewish history to criticize it as a state along with every other state. That's
I wasn't.
well, okay.
I wasn't using that to criticize Israel. Not about our 2,000 years of history. I'm saying that Israel is very different from any EU country and the United States.
Israel is very different from every EU
is
country because its neighbours refuse to trade with it, want to smash it up, and want to kill the people who live there. Now, after the Second World War and after the First World War, France put up a border against Germany, and they maintained that border with full seriousness, and they cultivated a legal and rights and democratic relationship with Germany until the situation changed such that they were willing to allow free movement across the border. I think we move on.
Well,
I do think we move on. Does anyone else have anything they would like to say or to ask? I'm going to give you the last word in a minute, David. I thought that was a really, really interesting discussion, and I thank you very much. And I just kind of reiterate really that there are not many academic spaces in Britain or anywhere at the moment where a discussion like this can be had in a serious way, like it has been had tonight. And I think that is why why the London Centre exists and why it needs to exist. And very, very happy to have had you speaking tonight, David. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for all the questions. I guess just my last comment goes to Simon to an extent. There are real political issues relating to Israel, its neighbors, what's going on in Lebanon, what's going on in Gaza, what's going on in Israel itself. But that's not really what I was trying to talk about. Simon and others, we can all have a fabulous, interesting, disagreement on Israel and so on and so forth. But that wasn't what I was talking about today. I was talking about the imagery of Israel and Holocaust memory, actually, through the prism of the Jewish question. So, in a way, that question was outside my ambit of my paper. But I'd like to thank the London Centre, which, as you know, I adore. I'd like to thank everyone. It's lovely seeing some of my friends here as well. And thank you very much indeed, David. And very quietly in the background, also thank you to Martin as well. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very, very much, David. And I'm not certain that it was outside the ambit of your paper, because it seems to me that the Bruno Bauer intervention into the Jewish question, which says, the Jews have to do some work before they are allowed emancipation, and they have to emancipate themselves from their own backward religion and from their own backward politics. And then there would be no problem with them joining the rest of the of the community of emancipated, right-bearing human beings. It seems to me that that whole way of conditionalizing the Jewish emancipation is getting kind of repeated and circulated yet again, I think. Thank you very much. I promised I'd give you the last word, and then I took the last word for myself. There you go. I'm like that. Thank you very much, David. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Good evening.